The conference room smelled like old leather and expensive cologne. I sat rigid in the chair, fingers gripping the armrest hard enough to leave marks. Across the mahogany table, Patricia smiled at me with those perfectly veneered teeth, the same smile she'd worn at Dad's funeral 3 days ago. Sympathetic to strangers, triumphant when she thought no one was looking. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. James Morrison shuffled papers at the head of the table, his silver reading glasses catching the afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his downtown Portland office. He'd been Dad's attorney for 30 years, present at every major milestone of Richard Chen's life. The birth of his architecture firm. My mother's funeral. His catastrophic second marriage to the woman now examining her manicure like she owned the place. She did own the place, actually. Or thought she did. Shall we begin? James asked, his voice carrying that measured tone lawyers perfect over decades of delivering news both good and devastating. Patricia leaned forward, placing her designer handbag on the table with deliberate care. I think we're all anxious to move forward. Richard's death has been so difficult for everyone. Her voice dripped with practiced grief, the kind you learn from watching too many Lifetime movies. I said nothing. Hadn't spoken to her directly since the funeral, where she'd made a show of collapsing against the casket while wearing a black dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent. My half-sister Sophie sat beside her mother, 19 and miserable, avoiding my eyes. I didn't blame her. This circus wasn't her fault. Uncle David sat to my right, Dad's business partner and brother, his jaw tight with barely contained anger. He'd watched Patricia systematically isolate Dad during those final 8 months of illness, controlling who could visit, screening phone calls, playing devoted wife while slowly poisoning every relationship Dad had built over 63 years. The last will and testament of Richard James Chen, James began, opening the leather portfolio before him. Dated March 15th of this year. March. 2 months before Dad died. 1 month after Patricia had convinced him to stop seeing visitors because they tired him out too much. 1 month after I'd driven down from Seattle only to be turned away at the door of my childhood home by a woman who'd known my father for barely 4 years. James read through the standard legal language, the whereas and heretofore that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. Patricia's smile widened with each paragraph. I felt my stomach tightening, that familiar weight of dread I'd carried since the day Dad called to tell me he was marrying a woman he'd met at a real estate conference 6 months prior. To my beloved wife Patricia, James continued, his voice carefully neutral, I leave the family residence located at 2847 Laurelhurst Drive, along with all furnishings, vehicles, and personal effects contained therein. The Craftsman house Dad had bought with my mother in 1989. Where I'd learned to ride a bike in the driveway. Where Mom had died in the upstairs bedroom, Dad holding her hand. Where I'd studied for the SATs at the kitchen table Dad had built himself from reclaimed wood. Gone. Patricia's perfectly manicured fingers drummed once on the table, a small gesture of victory. Additionally, James said, Patricia receives full ownership of the joint bank accounts, investment portfolios established during the marriage, and the life insurance policy in the amount of $500,000. Uncle David's hand found mine under the table, squeezing. Steady. Wait. To my daughter Maya Chen, James looked up at me now, something flickering behind his professional expression. I leave my collection of architectural books and my drafting tools from college. The room went silent. Even Patricia had the decency to pause her victory lap, though I caught the corner of her mouth twitching upward. That's it? I heard myself say, voice barely above a whisper. Books and old tools? Patricia leaned back in her chair, expansive in her generosity now that she'd won. Your father and I discussed this extensively, Maya. He felt that since you'd chosen to move away, to build your life in Seattle, you'd made your priorities clear. The family home should go to family who actually stayed. Family who stayed. The words hit like a slap. I'd left Portland because watching Patricia manipulate my father was slowly destroying me. Because every dinner ended in her subtle criticisms of my career choice, my apartment, my decision to stay single. Because Dad had changed under her influence, becoming smaller, quieter, more isolated from everyone who'd known him before. The architectural firm, Uncle David interrupted, his voice sharp. Chen and Associates. What about Richard's share? James flipped a page, and I caught something, a hesitation, a careful recalibration of his expression. Richard's 50% ownership stake in Chen and Associates architecture transfers to Patricia Delaney Chen, with the provision that she may retain or sell her shares at her discretion. The firm Dad had built from nothing. 40 years of work, of late nights and inspired designs, of buildings that changed Portland's skyline. In Patricia's hands, who'd spent the last 4 years trying to convince him to sell out to a corporate conglomerate. Uncle David stood abruptly. This is unacceptable. Richard would never. Richard did. Patricia cut him off, smooth as silk. I have the marriage certificate. Community property laws are quite clear in Oregon. What's his became mine when we married. She turned to me, and for just a second, the mask slipped. Pure contempt flashed across her features before the sympathetic smile returned. I'm sorry you're disappointed, Maya. Perhaps if you'd spent more time with your father in his final years instead of hiding in Seattle, things might have been different. I stood, chair scraping against hardwood. I needed air. Needed to be anywhere but in this room where my father's entire legacy had just been handed to a woman who'd seen him as nothing more than a retirement plan. Maya, wait. James's voice stopped me at the door. We're not quite finished. I turned, expecting what? Another paragraph about how Dad's watch collection went to some charity Patricia had selected. His wedding ring melted down for scrap. James reached into his briefcase and pulled out a second envelope. Cream-colored, sealed with red wax, my father's architectural seal pressed into it. The same seal he'd used on his most important documents, the signature projects that defined his career. What is that? Patricia's voice had lost its smooth confidence. A codicil to the will, James said, setting the envelope on the table. Executed on May 2nd, witnessed by myself and Dr. Helen Wong, Richard's physician. 2 weeks before his death. The air in the conference room changed. Patricia had gone very still, her hands flat on the table. Sophie looked between her mother and the attorney, confusion replacing her earlier resignation. Uncle David sat back down slowly, his attention laser-focused on that cream envelope. Richard came to my office on May 2nd, James continued, his professional veneer cracking slightly to reveal something underneath. Satisfaction, maybe. Or justice delayed. He was quite insistent about the timing. He'd been reviewing his financial records and discovered some irregularities that concerned him greatly. Irregularities? Patricia's laugh was forced, brittle. James, Richard was on heavy medication those final weeks. He was confused, paranoid even. You can't possibly consider. He was lucid, James interrupted, the first time I'd ever heard him be anything but meticulously polite. Dr. Wong's assessment is included in the documentation. Richard Chen was of sound mind and clear judgment when he executed this codicil. My heart hammered against my ribs. Dad had known. Somehow, despite the isolation, despite Patricia's careful management of his final months, he'd known. James broke the wax seal and extracted several documents. The first was indeed a codicil, legal addendum to the will he'd just read. But beneath it were other papers, printouts, financial statements with highlighted sections, handwritten notes in Dad's distinctive architect's printing. The codicil revokes several provisions of the March will, James began reading. Specifically, regarding the distribution of assets acquired prior to Richard's marriage to Patricia Delaney. That's not legal, Patricia stood now, color rising in her carefully made-up face. We were married. Community property applies to everything. Not to assets placed in trust prior to the marriage, James corrected. Which is what Richard did in 2018, shortly before he met you, Patricia. The family home, his share of Chen and Associates, and the majority of his investment portfolio were transferred to an irrevocable trust with Maya as the primary beneficiary. The words didn't make sense at first. My brain couldn't process them. Trust? Beneficiary? Dad had never mentioned any trust. That's impossible, Patricia's voice had gone shrill. I would have known. Richard told me everything. Richard told you what he needed you to know, Uncle David said quietly, and there was something in his voice. He'd known. My uncle had known about this. James continued reading. The trust was established to protect family assets in the event of Richard's death or incapacitation. Only assets acquired during the marriage and jointly titled remain subject to community property distribution. So the house, I started, reverts to you, James confirmed. Along with your father's 50% of the architectural firm, his personal investment accounts established before 2019, and several other assets detailed in the trust documents. Patricia grabbed her handbag, fumbling for her phone. This won't hold up. I'll contest this. Richard was manipulated, clearly suffering from terminal cancer and the clarity it often brings, James said, his voice hard now. Which is why he also left this. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He pulled out a USB drive. Video testimony, recorded in this office on May 2nd, explaining exactly why he created the trust and executed this codicil. The room seemed to tilt. Dad had recorded something. A message. For me? For the court? Richard was very specific about what should be included. James plugged the drive into his laptop and turned the screen so we could all see. He wanted there to be no question about his intentions or his reasoning. The video player opened. There was my father, thinner than I remembered, the illness evident in his gaunt features and the oxygen cannula in his nose. But his eyes were clear, sharp, focused. The same eyes that had taught me to see the bones of a building, the structure beneath the aesthetic. If you're watching this, Dad's voice filled the conference room, and I felt tears burning behind my eyes. Then I'm gone, and Patricia is probably very angry right now. Despite everything, I almost laughed. That was Dad. Direct. Unsentimental about unpleasant truths. I need to explain some things, the recording continued. About the trust, about the assets, about why I made the choices I did. He paused, gathering strength or thoughts or both. When I married Patricia 4 years ago, I believed I'd found companionship for my remaining years. Your mother had been gone for so long, Maya, and the house felt empty. Patricia had sat back down, her face pale beneath the makeup. I was lonely and perhaps not as discerning as I should have been, Dad said. It took me too long to see what Patricia really wanted. Or maybe I saw it and convinced myself I was wrong. That I was being paranoid or ungrateful. The camera stayed steady on his face as he spoke. Professional setup. James had made sure this would be admissible, unquestionable. 6 months ago, I started noticing irregularities in our accounts. Money moving in ways I hadn't authorized. My signature on documents I didn't remember signing. When I asked Patricia about it, she said I was confused from the medication, that I'd approved everything but forgotten. Uncle David's hand found my shoulder. On screen, my father's jaw tightened with determination. So I started keeping my own records. Copies of every statement, every transaction, every document that crossed my desk. And I discovered that my wife had been systematically transferring assets, forging my signature on loan applications, using the firm's credit to fund personal expenses. Patricia stood again. This is slander. I'm leaving. Sit down, James said, and there was steel in his voice I'd never heard before. Or I call the district attorney's office right now. Your choice. She sat. On screen, Dad continued. I established the trust years ago as a standard estate planning measure. When I realized what Patricia was doing, I activated its protections and executed this codicil to ensure that what I built, what your mother and I built together, Maya, would remain in the family. He leaned closer to the camera. I'm sorry I wasn't stronger. Sorry I let her isolate you from me these last months. I was trying to document everything, to build a case that would protect you after I was gone. My throat ached with unshed tears. He'd known. He'd been fighting even while dying. James has all the documentation, Dad said. Financial records, forged signatures, witness statements from people Patricia thought she'd intimidated into silence. Use it, Maya. Don't let her get away with what she's done. He smiled then, tired but genuine. You're stronger than you know, sweetheart. You always have been. Build something beautiful with what I'm leaving you. That's all I ever wanted. The video ended. Silence filled the conference room, broken only by Sophie's quiet crying. Even she hadn't known the extent of her mother's deception. James closed the laptop and looked directly at Patricia. The trust documents are filed with the county. The video testimony is authenticated and witnessed. The forensic accounting Richard commissioned has been turned over to the appropriate authorities. He paused. You have two choices. Sign the acknowledgement that you understand the codicil's terms and relinquish all claim to the trust assets, or we proceed with both civil and criminal litigation. Patricia's carefully constructed world was crumbling in real time. I watched emotions flicker across her face. Rage, fear, calculation, desperation. Looking for an angle, a way out, something she could manipulate or spin. She found nothing. How long have you known? She finally asked James, her voice stripped of its earlier confidence. Since May 3rd, he replied. The day after Richard recorded his testimony. I've been executing his instructions to the letter. Patricia looked at me then, really looked at me, and what I saw wasn't the stepmother who'd taken over my father's life. It was a con artist whose mark had outsmarted her from beyond the grave. This isn't over, she said, but there was no conviction behind the words. Actually, James replied, it is. I signed the acknowledgement papers 3 days later in James Morrison's office. Patricia didn't show. Her attorney, a nervous man named Gerald something, handled the transfer with the enthusiasm of someone defusing a bomb. Sophie had called me the night before, voice shaking, to apologize for everything her mother had done. I told her none of it was her fault. She was as much a victim of Patricia's schemes as anyone. The keys to the Laurelhurst house felt heavy in my palm. I stood on the sidewalk outside the Craftsman, hesitating before walking up the steps I'd climbed thousands of times as a child. The azaleas Mom had planted were overgrown, blooming in defiant purples and pinks despite years of Patricia's neglect. Dad's workshop light was on in the garage, and for one irrational moment I expected him to emerge with sawdust in his hair, asking what I thought about his latest project. The front door stuck slightly, swollen from Portland's spring rain. Inside, the house smelled wrong. Patricia's perfume still lingered, expensive and cloying, covering the familiar scents of Dad's coffee and the old wood polish Mom had used on the floors. I walked through rooms that felt simultaneously mine and alien, cataloging what had changed. The family photos were gone from the hallway, replaced with Patricia's abstract art purchases, the kind sold at hotel liquidation sales. Dad's reading chair in the living room had been reupholstered in cream leather, erasing the comfortable worn patches where his elbows had rested. The kitchen cabinets Mom had painstakingly refinished were painted a trendy gray that made the space feel cold. I found myself in Dad's study, the one room Patricia apparently hadn't touched, probably because she couldn't sell anything in it quickly enough. His drafting table still held his last project, a community center design he'd been working on before the cancer made it impossible to focus. Pencil sketches, elevation drawings, notes in his precise handwriting about natural light and traffic flow. Uncle David found me there an hour later, sitting at Dad's desk, surrounded by papers and memories. Thought I'd find you here, he said, settling into the client chair across from me. He looked older than he had at the will reading, the stress of the past weeks written in new lines around his eyes. How are you holding up? I keep expecting him to walk in and tell me I'm doing the measurements wrong, I said, trying to smile and failing. This whole place is wrong without him. David nodded, understanding without needing elaboration. He and Dad had been more than brothers and business partners. They'd been best friends since childhood, built the firm together from a shared apartment and a dream. Patricia moved out yesterday, he said. Took what she could legally claim, which wasn't much after the trust stipulations. Sophie helped me change the locks. Your half-sister is tougher than she looks. Is Patricia going to face charges? I asked, thinking of the forged documents, the transferred funds, the systematic looting of Dad's accounts. James is working with the DA's office. The forensic accountant Dad hired documented everything. Wire transfers to accounts in Patricia's name, signatures that don't match Dad's handwriting, loans taken out using forged authorization. It's substantial enough for fraud charges, possibly elder abuse given Dad's illness. David leaned forward. But that's not why I'm here. We need to talk about the firm. Chen and Associates Architecture occupied the top floor of a renovated warehouse in the Pearl District. I hadn't been there in 3 years, not since Patricia had made it clear my visits weren't welcome. Walking through the glass doors felt like stepping back in time. The reception area still featured Dad's early sketches, the designs that had launched his career in the 80s. The conference room still had the massive table he and David had built themselves from salvaged Douglas fir. The staff, 15 architects and designers, gathered for an emergency meeting. They'd heard about Dad's death, attended the funeral, but the details of the will and Patricia's attempted takeover were news. I watched their faces as David explained the situation, saw relief mixed with apprehension. They'd worked under the threat of corporate acquisition for years, Patricia whispering in Dad's ear about selling out, about cashing in. Maya now owns Richard's 50%, David concluded. Which makes her my partner, assuming she wants the position. All eyes turned to me. I'd spent the past week wrestling with this exact question. My life was in Seattle, my career in marine biology carefully built over a decade. Taking over Dad's share of the firm would mean relocating, learning a business I deliberately avoided, stepping into shoes I'd never prepared to fill. But I'd also spent the past week reading through Dad's files, studying his projects, understanding the philosophy behind his designs. Sustainable architecture. Community integration. Buildings that enhanced rather than dominated their environments. It wasn't so different from my work with marine ecosystems, understanding how elements interacted, how to preserve delicate balances. I want to understand what I'm stepping into, I said carefully. The firm's financial position, current projects, long-term contracts. I'm not an architect, and I won't pretend expertise I don't have. But I understand business management, and I understand Dad's vision. Sarah Kim, the senior designer, spoke up. Your father always said architecture was about more than buildings. It was about understanding systems, seeing how pieces fit together. Sounds like you learned that lesson, just in a different context. The meeting lasted 3 hours. David walked me through current projects, a mixed-use development downtown, a renovation of a historic schoolhouse, the community center Dad had been designing. The firm was solvent, profitable even, but had been operating under uncertainty for too long. Clients were hesitant to commit to major projects without knowing the firm's future. We need to make a decision about leadership, David said as the staff filtered out. I'm 65. I was planning to retire in a few years, let Richard take the helm fully. Now we're at a crossroads. What do you want to happen? I asked. He looked at the sketches on the conference room walls, decades of work, of collaboration, of buildings that had shaped Portland's landscape. I want Chen and Associates to survive. I want your father's legacy to continue. But I'm also realistic. You have a career, a life elsewhere. If you decide to sell your share, I'll understand. To who? A corporate firm that'll strip the name and turn us into another cookie-cutter operation? There are other options. Smaller firms, boutique operations that might preserve the culture. I thought about Patricia, about how she tried to erase Dad's presence from his own house, his own life. About the video testimony where he'd asked me to build something beautiful with what he was leaving me. I need to see the community center designs, I said. Dad's last project. I want to understand what he was trying to create. We spent the evening in Dad's private office, a small space tucked behind the main studio. His design boards covered the walls, evolution of ideas rendered in pencil and ink. The community center was intended for a struggling neighborhood in North Portland, a place that had seen decades of disinvestment. Dad's design was ambitious: multi-generational spaces, sustainable systems, local material sourcing. It was also expensive, probably more than the community could afford. He was trying to figure out the funding when he got too sick to work, David explained. Mix of grants, city support, private donations. It was his passion project, something he wanted to complete before he retired. I studied the elevations, the careful attention to light and flow, the way the building seemed to grow from its site rather than imposing on it. This was Dad at his best, designing not just structures but community anchors. What if we made this the firm's focus? I asked. Not just this project, but this approach. Sustainable, community-centered architecture for clients who need it most. Use the profitable commercial work to fund projects like this. David considered, calculator brain running numbers. It's risky. Margins would be tighter. We'd need to be selective about commercial projects, only take ones that align with our values. But we'd be doing what Dad believed in. Building things that matter, not just things that make money. You sound like your father, David said, and there was warmth in his voice. He had this same conversation with me 30 years ago when we were starting out. I told him we'd go broke being idealistic. He told me we'd go broke anyway, might as well do it building things we believed in. How'd that work out? We're still here. He smiled. And we never went broke. Close a few times, but never broke. I made my decision then, standing in Dad's office, surrounded by his unfinished dreams. I'll do it. Take over his share, partner with you. I'll need to finish my current research contract in Seattle, probably 3 months. But after that, I'm moving back to Portland. David stood, extending his hand formally. Welcome aboard, partner. Your father would be proud. He'd probably tell me I'm crazy and should stick with fish, I said, shaking his hand. He'd tell you that. Then he'd stay up all night helping you plan how to make it work. That was Richard. Practical pessimist with an optimistic work ethic. The next morning I met with James Morrison to discuss the logistics of unwinding Patricia's 4 years of financial manipulation. The forensic accountant, a precise woman named Dr. Ellen Rodriguez, had prepared a detailed report that read like a thriller. Forged signatures, transferred funds, credit cards opened in Dad's name, loans secured against business assets Patricia had no authority to leverage. The total is approximately $340,000, Ellen explained, spreadsheets and bank statements covering the conference table. Most of it in the 18 months before Richard's death, when his illness made it difficult for him to monitor accounts closely. Can we recover any of it? I asked. Some. Patricia spent lavishly, luxury purchases, travel, home improvements. But she also transferred significant amounts to accounts we've identified. With the fraud documentation, we can pursue civil recovery. The criminal charges may also result in restitution orders. James added, Patricia's attorney has indicated she might be willing to negotiate a settlement to avoid trial. She's looking at substantial prison time if this goes forward. Fraud, forgery, elder abuse of a vulnerable adult. Oregon takes these cases seriously. What would a settlement look like? Full repayment of documented fraud, surrender of all disputed assets, permanent restraining order preventing contact with you or Sophie, and guilty plea to reduce charges. She'd likely get probation and restitution payments rather than prison time. I thought about Dad's video testimony, his quiet dignity in the face of betrayal. About the months Patricia had isolated him, controlling who he saw, what information reached him. About the moment at the funeral when she'd collapsed dramatically against his casket while wearing jewelry purchased with stolen funds. No settlement, I said. Dad documented everything specifically so there would be accountability. Let the DA file charges. Let a court decide what justice looks like. James nodded slowly. I should mention that Sophie wants to testify. She's willing to provide evidence about her mother's activities, things she witnessed but didn't understand at the time. That surprised me. Sophie had been quiet at the will reading, clearly uncomfortable but not actively participating. Is she okay? This can't be easy, testifying against her own mother. "She's angry," James said simply. Angry at being used as part of Patricia's cover, angry at not seeing what was happening, angry that her mother would do this to someone who'd been kind to her. "Sophie may not be your blood sister, but she considers Richard her father figure. Patricia's actions hurt her too. I met Sophie for coffee that afternoon at Dad's favorite place, a small shop near the architecture firm that served terrible coffee and excellent pastries. She looked exhausted, her 19 years showing in the dark circles under her eyes. "I should have known," she said without preamble. "I lived in that house. I saw things that didn't make sense. But Mom always had explanations, and I wanted to believe her. You're not responsible for your mother's choices," I told her, echoing what I'd said on the phone. "But I benefited from them. The car she bought me last year, my college tuition, the clothes, the trips. All of it was Richard's money that she stole." Sophie's voice cracked. "He was good to me. Better than my biological father ever was. And I let her use me as a prop in her con." I reached across the table, taking her hand. "Sophie, you were a kid. You trusted your mother because that's what kids do. This isn't your fault. Will you let me help make it right? Testifying, whatever else you need. I have access to Mom's storage unit, places she might have hidden documents or assets. I want to help." We spent 2 hours in that coffee shop, Sophie detailing Patricia's behaviors she'd witnessed but not understood. Intercepted mail. Late-night phone calls about money. Arguments with Dad that ended with him apologizing for things he hadn't done. The medical power of attorney Patricia had insisted was necessary to coordinate Dad's care but used to control his access to everyone. "She told me you didn't want to see him," Sophie said quietly. "That you'd made it clear you weren't interested in being part of his life anymore." I believed her because it fit the narrative she'd built about you being ungrateful, abandoning family. "I tried to visit," I said. "Multiple times. She turned me away every time, said Dad was sleeping or having a bad day or didn't want company. I thought maybe he really didn't want to see me, that I'd damaged our relationship by moving away. He asked about you constantly. Even at the end, when he could barely talk, he'd say your name. Mom would tell him you were busy with work, that you'd visit when you had time. She was lying to both of you, keeping you apart. That hurt worse than the stolen money, worse than the forged documents. Patricia hadn't just taken Dad's assets. She'd stolen his final months, the time we could have had together, conversations we'd never have. That was the unforgivable part, the theft that couldn't be recovered or compensated. We left the coffee shop with a plan. Sophie would document everything she knew, provide access to Patricia's hidden storage, testify about the isolation tactics. In return, I promised to help her finish college, free from her mother's financial manipulation and control. Uncle David called that evening as I was boxing up Patricia's belongings from the house, separating what was legally hers from what she'd acquired with stolen funds. City Council approved the community center project, he said, excitement breaking through his usual measured tone. Full funding package, grants and city support. They want to name it the Richard Chen Community Center. They're asking if we'll still take the contract. I looked around Dad's study, at the unfinished drawings, the careful notes about sunlight and community needs. At the vision of a building that would serve people who needed it most. "We'll take it," I said. "And we'll build it exactly as Dad designed it. There's one condition. They want you to present the final design to the community. As Richard's daughter and new partner in the firm. They want to meet the person who'll be overseeing the project. My first public appearance as an architect, presenting a building I hadn't designed, stepping into my father's enormous shoes." The panic must have shown in my voice because David laughed. "You'll be fine. Just tell them what the building means, what Richard wanted it to be. You understand that better than anyone. You're his daughter. That vision is in your DNA whether you studied architecture or not." I spent the next week preparing, reading everything Dad had written about the community center, studying his design philosophy, understanding not just what he'd drawn but why. Marine biology and architecture weren't so different after all. Both required understanding systems, seeing how elements interacted, recognizing that the whole was greater than its parts. The community meeting was held in a high school gymnasium, folding chairs arranged in rows, neighborhood residents skeptical of another promise from outsiders. I stood at the podium with Dad's drawings projected behind me, 30 years of marine biology presentations suddenly inadequate preparation. My father believed buildings should serve communities, not dominate them, I began, voice shakier than I wanted. He designed this center to be a gathering place, somewhere multi-generational, accessible, sustainable. Not because those are trendy architectural concepts, but because they're what this neighborhood needs. I walked them through the design, translating Dad's technical drawings into human terms. The commercial kitchen for community meals and culinary training. The flexible meeting spaces that could host everything from job fairs to quinceañeras. The rooftop garden where residents could grow food and gather. The ground floor retail spaces reserved for local entrepreneurs. This was my father's last project, I said, reaching the conclusion I'd written and rewritten a dozen times. He died before seeing it built. But he designed it with love for this community, with respect for what you need and who you are. Chen and Associates commits to building this exactly as he envisioned, working with community input, hiring local labor, creating something that will serve generations. The applause was polite but reserved. Then an elderly woman in the front row stood. "I knew your father," she said, voice carrying across the gym. 20 years ago, he redesigned our church after a fire, did it for cost because that's all we could afford. He said then that buildings should heal communities, not just house them. If you're half the architect he was, if you build with half his integrity, this center will be exactly what we need. Others stood, sharing their own Richard Chen stories. The affordable housing project that revitalized a struggling block. The school addition that doubled as an emergency shelter. The commercial building that preserved historic facades while creating modern spaces. Dad's legacy wasn't in awards or prestigious projects. It was in these stories, these communities, these buildings that mattered. I left that meeting understanding what I'd committed to. Not just finishing Dad's last project, but continuing his approach, his values, his belief that architecture could improve lives rather than just fill skylines. The criminal charges against Patricia were filed 2 weeks later. Elder financial abuse, forgery, wire fraud, theft. The DA's office took James's documentation and Sophie's testimony and built a case that made Patricia's attorney extremely nervous. They filed motion after motion to dismiss, to suppress evidence, to delay trial. Nothing worked. Dad's video testimony was unimpeachable, the forensic accounting irrefutable. Patricia's attorney called James 3 days before the scheduled trial. "My client wants to discuss terms," he said, sounding defeated. The negotiation happened in a windowless conference room downtown, both sides with attorneys present, no direct contact between Patricia and me. Her attorney presented an offer. Guilty plea to reduced charges, full restitution over 20 years, probation instead of prison time. "No," I said immediately. Patricia's attorney sighed. "Ms. Chen, my client is willing to admit wrongdoing and repay every dollar. What more do you want?" "Accountability," I said. "Your client didn't just steal money. She isolated a dying man from his family, forged his signature, sold his belongings, tried to steal his life's work. She did it deliberately, systematically, over years. Probation isn't justice. It's permission to do it again to the next vulnerable person she meets." We went to trial. The courthouse was old Portland architecture, stone and dignity, courtrooms paneled in dark wood. Sophie testified first, describing her mother's manipulation, the controlled access to Dad, the intercepted communications. Dr. Helen Wong testified about Dad's lucidity, his awareness of what Patricia was doing. The forensic accountant presented her findings, a financial trail of theft. James played Dad's video testimony for the jury. 12 people watching my father, visibly ill but mentally sharp, explaining how his wife had betrayed him. Some jurors cried. Patricia stared at her hands, refusing to watch. The prosecutor held up Dad's forged signature next to his genuine one. Even a non-expert could see the differences, the hesitation marks, the wrong pressure. Richard Chen was an architect, the prosecutor said. His signature was distinctive, precise, unique. Patricia Delaney didn't even bother to practice before forging it. She thought he was too sick to notice, too isolated to fight back. The defense tried. Patricia's attorney painted her as a devoted wife overwhelmed by medical bills, confused by complex finances, making mistakes rather than committing crimes. But the video testimony destroyed that narrative. Dad explaining, in his own words, how he discovered the theft, documented it, built a case against his own wife. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Patricia's face went white. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks out. Sophie found me outside the courtroom, mascara smeared from crying. "Thank you," she said. "For not taking the settlement. For making sure there were consequences. Richard deserved that." "He deserved to live," I said. "To see the community center built, to retire with dignity, to spend his last months surrounded by people who loved him. But justice is what we can give him now." At sentencing, the judge allowed victim impact statements. I'd prepared mine carefully, working with James to articulate the full scope of Patricia's damage. Patricia Delaney didn't just steal money, I read, my voice steady in the formal courtroom. She stole time. She stole my father's final months, keeping him isolated from family and friends. She stole his dignity, forging his name, selling his belongings, treating his life's work as assets to liquidate. She stole his peace, making him spend his dying days building legal cases instead of making memories. The financial theft can be repaid. The rest cannot. The judge sentenced Patricia to 6 years in prison, full restitution, and permanent restraining orders preventing contact with Sophie or me. It wasn't everything, wasn't perfect justice, but it was something. Dad's video testimony had ensured Patricia faced real consequences, that her crimes weren't dismissed as family drama or civil disagreements. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked questions. I gave one statement. Richard Chen was an architect who believed buildings should serve communities. Patricia Delaney saw those buildings, that work, as commodities to exploit. The justice system recognized the difference. That's all we wanted. The Seattle Marine Research Facility accepted my resignation with surprising grace. Dr. Patricia Huang, my department head, actually smiled when I explained about inheriting the architecture firm. "You've been restless for months," she said, leaning back in her office chair surrounded by tanks of experimental coral colonies. "Ever since your father got sick. I wondered if you'd come back after the funeral." "I didn't plan this," I admitted. "I thought I'd handle the estate and return to my regular life. But there's unfinished work in Portland, things only I can complete now. Your dissertation on ecosystem restoration and built environments was always more interdisciplinary than pure marine biology. Maybe you were preparing for this without realizing it." She pulled out a folder. "I'm recommending you for an adjunct position at Portland State. Their environmental design program could use someone with your background. Keep a foot in academia while you build buildings." I hadn't considered teaching, hadn't thought beyond the immediate crisis of saving Dad's firm and finishing his community center. But Patricia was right. My research on how coastal developments impacted marine habitats translated directly to sustainable architecture. The methodologies were identical, understanding complex systems, minimizing human impact, creating harmony between built and natural environments. "I'll think about it," I said, taking the folder. "Don't think too long. The position starts fall semester. 3 months from now." Moving back to Portland happened in stages. First the essentials, clothes and research materials shipped south. Then the larger items, furniture I'd accumulated over a decade of Seattle living. Finally, the tank of rescue seahorses I'd been rehabilitating, delicate creatures that required careful transport and acclimation. Uncle David helped me set up the seahorse tank in Dad's study, now my study, watching the tiny animals explore their new filtered environment. "Richard would have loved this," he said. "He always wanted an aquarium, but your mother was allergic to the filtration systems." He settled for the koi pond in the backyard. The koi pond. I'd forgotten about it, hidden behind overgrown rhododendrons Patricia had never bothered to trim. We found it that afternoon, choked with algae and debris, the elaborate filtration system Dad had built himself long defunct. But the koi had survived, tough and resilient, waiting for someone to remember they existed. We'll need to restore this, I said, already mentally designing the project. Dad spent months building it, balancing the ecosystem, selecting the fish. It was his meditation space. We hired a pond restoration specialist, a quiet woman named Lynn who understood water systems like I understood marine habitats. She surveyed the damage with a professional eye, making notes and taking measurements. Your father knew what he was doing, Lynn said, examining the filtration setup. This is high-end work, custom built for this specific pond. With the right parts and some elbow grease, we can have it running perfectly again. The koi are healthy despite the neglect, which tells me the core system is sound. The restoration became a weekend project, David and I working alongside Lynn to clean decades of accumulated muck, repair broken pumps, rebalance the water chemistry. Sophie joined us on her breaks from community college, scrubbing stones and learning about beneficial bacteria. It was therapeutic, bringing something back to life that Patricia had left to die. The architectural firm demanded more immediate attention. I spent mornings at the Pearl District office, learning project management software, reviewing contracts, meeting clients who wanted assurance that Chen and Associates would continue Dad's standards. Afternoons were for the community center, working with contractors and city planners to translate Dad's drawings into actual construction. Sarah Kim became my informal mentor, patient with my architectural ignorance, impressed by my systems thinking. We'd sit in the conference room with coffee and blueprints, her explaining load calculations and building codes, me asking questions that ranged from basic to accidentally insightful. You see patterns differently than trained architects, she observed one afternoon. We're taught to think about space and structure first. You think about flow and interaction, how people and elements move through systems. It's actually more aligned with your father's philosophy than traditional training. The community center groundbreaking happened on a clear June morning. Neighborhood residents and city officials gathered at the empty lot that would become Dad's legacy. I gave a brief speech, mostly thanking the community for trusting us with something so important. Uncle David handed me a ceremonial shovel. I turned the first earth on what would be the Richard Chen Community Center, feeling the weight of expectation and promise. Construction moved faster than expected. The contractor, a firm Dad had worked with for 20 years, brought enthusiasm and precision to the project. They understood his design philosophy, had built enough of his projects to anticipate his intentions even where the drawings left room for interpretation. I visited the site daily, hard hat and work boots replacing my former lab coat and waders. The foundation went in first, sustainable materials and geothermal systems that would make the building energy efficient for decades. Then the frame, locally sourced timber that gave the structure warmth and character. Each phase revealed more of Dad's vision, the building emerging from drawings into three-dimensional reality. The Portland State teaching offer materialized into actual course assignments. Introduction to Environmental Design, cross-listed between architecture and environmental studies. I'd teach students to think about buildings as ecosystems, to consider human structures as part of larger environmental contexts rather than separate from them. Preparing lectures forced me to articulate principles I'd absorbed from Dad without conscious analysis. Buildings breathe, they interact with their surroundings, they affect and are affected by everything around them. Good architecture recognized this interdependence. Bad architecture ignored it and created problems that compounded over time. My first class had 23 students, mix of architecture majors and environmental science students curious about built environments. I stood at the front of the lecture hall, projector showing images of Dad's projects alongside natural ecosystems. Architecture and marine biology asked the same fundamental question, I began. How do we create sustainable systems that support life without destroying the environment that makes life possible? Today we're going to examine that question through two lenses, one natural and one built, and discuss why the distinction between them is increasingly meaningless. The semester became a rhythm. Teaching 2 mornings a week, Firm work the rest of the time, evenings spent on community center details or estate legal matters that still required attention. Patricia's restitution payments started arriving, court-mandated withdrawals from her prison account. $50 monthly against a $340,000 debt she'd be paying for decades. Sophie moved into the Laurelhurst house with me, claiming the guest room her mother had occupied. It was temporary, she insisted, just until she finished her associate degree and figured out her next steps. But having her there made the large house feel less empty, gave purpose to the restoration work we continued room by room. We stripped Patricia's gray paint from the kitchen cabinets, revealing Mom's careful refinishing underneath. We pulled up carpet to expose hardwood floors, finding more of Dad's hidden messages carved into the wood. We discovered a time capsule he'd sealed into the wall during a renovation, dated 1995, containing my baby photos and a letter to future occupants about the house's history. Richard really thought about legacy, Sophie said, reading the letter he'd written 27 years earlier. Not just leaving things behind, but leaving them with context, with story. Mom never understood that. She thought value was just monetary, what something could sell for rather than what it meant. The comparison between Patricia and Dad became increasingly stark as we uncovered more of his intentional design choices. Every detail served purpose beyond aesthetics. The built-in bookshelves positioned to catch morning light for reading. The kitchen workspace arranged for efficient meal preparation but also conversation. The workshop designed for both precision work and teaching, space for an adult and child to work side by side. Dad had built a home, not just a house. Patricia had tried to convert it into an asset, failing to recognize that homes derive value from meaning rather than market price. The forensic accountant's final report arrived in August, 300 pages documenting every transaction, every forgery, every theft. Dr. Rodriguez had traced money through multiple accounts, uncovered hidden credit cards, identified purchases Patricia had made and then concealed. The level of deception was staggering, requiring sustained effort and deliberate planning. This wasn't opportunistic theft, Ellen explained during our final meeting. This was systematic asset stripping. Patricia had a plan from the beginning, probably from before she married Richard. The marriage was her access point, and she executed her extraction strategy over 4 years. James Morrison added context. We've identified 2 previous husbands, both elderly and affluent, both died shortly after marrying Patricia. One was ruled natural causes, the other accidental death. Both left her substantial inheritances after short marriages. The implication hung in the air, ugly and unavoidable. Patricia wasn't just a thief. She was potentially a serial predator, targeting vulnerable older men for financial gain. Are the previous cases being investigated? I asked. The DA's office has requested files from those jurisdictions. Given the pattern and Patricia's current conviction, they're taking a harder look at those deaths. Richard may have survived her primarily because he documented everything and created protections you could enforce after his death. Dad had known, or suspected, that Patricia was dangerous beyond simple greed. That's why the codicil, the video testimony, the hidden evidence. He'd understood he was fighting someone who'd done this before and gotten away with it. The community center's frame was complete by September, the structure visible from blocks away. Neighborhood residents stopped by constantly, watching progress, offering suggestions, treating the project as collectively owned. Which was exactly what Dad had intended. Not a building imposed on a community, but a space created with and for them. I organized a community design day, inviting residents to paint murals on the interior walls before the finishing work began. Families came with their children, artists contributed time and talent, local businesses donated materials. The walls became a collective artwork, stories and images that reflected the neighborhood's diversity and history. One elderly man, Mr. Washington, painted a detailed scene of the neighborhood from the 1960s, buildings long demolished, businesses that had served generations. He worked slowly, meticulously, getting the details right. "Your father interviewed me for this project," he said, mixing colors on his palette. "Asked what the community needed, what we'd lost, what we hoped to build. Most architects come with plans already made, looking for approval not input. Richard came with questions and a blank page. That's why this building will work. It's not his vision imposed on us. It's our vision given structure by his expertise. The teaching position evolved beyond simple lectures. Students began proposing thesis projects that combined environmental science and architectural design. One wanted to study how building materials affected urban water quality. Another proposed redesigning a struggling neighborhood using ecosystem restoration principles. A third examined how affordable housing could incorporate sustainable systems without pricing out the people it was meant to serve. These were Dad's questions, the ones he'd spent 40 years exploring. Watching students wrestle with them, seeing new minds apply fresh perspectives to persistent problems, felt like extending his work beyond what any single person could accomplish. Sarah Kim approached me in October with a proposal. The firm had been invited to bid on a major civic project, a new library for a suburb struggling with budget constraints and community division over priorities. This is exactly the kind of project Richard loved, she said, spreading the request for proposals across the conference table. Complicated client, limited budget, high community impact. It's also way outside our current capacity unless we bring in additional expertise. What kind of expertise? Environmental systems, sustainable design, community engagement processes. Skills we have scattered across the team but not concentrated enough for a project this size. She looked at me directly. Skills you have. Not as an architect, but as a researcher and teacher. If you co-led this proposal, integrating your environmental design approach with our architectural capabilities, we'd have something unique to offer. The proposal consumed 6 weeks. I worked with the team to develop a design that treated the library as a community ecosystem, not just a book repository. Multi-use spaces that could host everything from job training to farmers markets. Sustainable systems that reduced operating costs while teaching environmental principles. Accessible design that welcomed everyone regardless of physical ability or economic status. Community engagement throughout construction, turning the building process itself into an educational opportunity. We submitted the proposal in November, knowing we were competing against larger firms with more prestigious portfolios. But we also knew our approach was different, more aligned with the community's stated needs and budget realities. The community center neared completion as winter arrived. Interior work progressed through December, the commercial kitchen taking shape, the flexible meeting rooms receiving their finishes, the rooftop garden preparing for spring planting. The building had transformed from Dad's drawings into something tangible and beautiful, every detail honoring his vision while incorporating community input. Patricia's first parole hearing was scheduled for January, 5 months into her 6-year sentence. Oregon law required hearings at regular intervals, though approval was unlikely for serious fraud convictions. James prepared our opposition statement, documenting why early release would be inappropriate. Sophie declined to attend the hearing, still processing her mother's crimes. "I've given my written statement," she said. "That's all I can do. I'm building a life that isn't defined by her choices. Going to that hearing would be stepping backward." I understood. Sophie had enrolled in Portland State's social work program, determined to help people avoid the manipulation she'd witnessed. She volunteered at a senior center, providing companionship and advocacy for elderly people who might be vulnerable to predators like her mother. She'd transformed her guilt into action, which was more than most people managed. The parole hearing lasted 30 minutes. Patricia's attorney argued she'd been a model prisoner, participating in financial literacy programs, expressing remorse. The parole board reviewed her criminal history, the pattern of predatory behavior, the systematic nature of her crimes against Dad. Parole denied, the board chair announced. Next hearing in 18 months. "Ms. Delaney, you are remanded to continued custody." Patricia looked older, prison life eroding the careful maintenance she'd always projected. She glanced at me once as guards led her away, and I saw something that might have been remorse or might have been calculation. With Patricia, it was impossible to tell. The Richard Chen Community Center opened on a bright February morning, ribbon-cutting ceremony attended by hundreds of neighborhood residents. The mayor gave a speech about community investment and sustainable development. Uncle David spoke about Dad's vision and commitment to meaningful architecture. Then they asked me to say something, to represent the family and the firm that had built Dad's final dream. I stood at the podium looking at the building behind me, at the community that had embraced it, at the future it represented. My father believed architecture was about people, not buildings, I said. He believed spaces should serve communities, should adapt to needs, should make lives better in measurable ways. This center embodies those beliefs. It's not a monument to Richard Chen. It's a tool for this community, built by this community, sustained by this community. That's the legacy he hoped for. Not his name on a building, but his values in how the building functions. We opened the doors and residents flooded in, exploring the kitchen, the meeting rooms, the rooftop garden. Children ran through the flexible spaces, already claiming them. Elderly residents settled into the reading nook by windows that captured southern light. Local entrepreneurs examined the retail spaces, mentally planning businesses. The building worked. You could feel it in how naturally people moved through the space, how intuitively they understood its purposes. Dad had designed it perfectly, anticipating needs and creating solutions before they were articulated. Uncle David found me on the rooftop garden an hour into the celebration, watching the city spread below us. "Your father would be impossibly proud," he said. "Not just of the building, though it's magnificent. Of you, taking over the firm, finishing his work, continuing his approach. He worried you'd feel obligated rather than called to this. That the inheritance would be a burden instead of an opportunity." It was both, I admitted. Still is some days. But I understand now what he was doing, why he structured everything the way he did. He wasn't forcing me into architecture. He was protecting the ability to choose, making sure I'd have options after he was gone. The firm, the house, the projects, they're not obligations. They're possibilities. Sarah Kim called the following week with news about the library proposal. We'd won the contract. The selection committee had praised our integrated approach, the way we'd connected environmental design with community needs, the emphasis on sustainable systems and inclusive access. "This is a significant project," Sarah said. $3 million budget, 2-year timeline, high visibility. It's going to stretch our capacity. We'll need to hire additional staff, maybe partner with specialty consultants. Are you ready to co-lead something this complex? I thought about Dad's workshop, about learning to use tools beside him, about his patient instruction on measuring twice and cutting once. About the community center and the countless decisions that had gone into translating his vision into reality. "Yes," I said. "Let's build something meaningful." The firm expanded that spring, adding 3 new designers and partnering with environmental engineering consultants. The library project kicked off with community meetings, exactly the kind of engagement process Dad had pioneered. We listened more than we talked, taking notes, understanding needs, building relationships. The house renovation continued room by room, Sophie and I stripping away Patricia's changes and restoring Dad's original design. We found more hidden compartments, more time capsules, more evidence of his meticulous planning. Each discovery felt like receiving a message across time, Dad's voice offering guidance and encouragement. The koi pond was fully restored by summer, filtration system humming, water clear, fish thriving. I'd sit there in the evenings after work, watching the koi glide through the water, understanding why Dad had found it meditative. Complex systems finding balance, biological and mechanical elements working together, beauty emerging from thoughtful design. Sophie graduated with her associate degree in June, planning to transfer to Portland State's bachelor program in social work. She'd found her calling working with vulnerable adults, using her experience with Patricia to recognize and prevent exploitation. "I'm going to specialize in elder abuse prevention," she announced over celebration dinner in the restored kitchen. "Make sure what Richard went through doesn't happen to other people. Turn Mom's crimes into something that actually helps people." That was resilience, transforming trauma into purpose. Sophie had every reason to be bitter, angry, broken by her mother's actions. Instead, she'd chosen to build something positive from the wreckage. Patricia's restitution payments continued arriving monthly, tiny amounts against massive debt. The prosecutor estimated full repayment would take 43 years at the current rate. Patricia would be 90 if she lived long enough to complete her obligation. Justice moved slowly, but it moved. The teaching position became permanent that fall, Portland State offering a tenure-track assistant professorship in environmental design. I'd be splitting time between academia and practice, exactly the balance Dad had always recommended. Architects need theory informed by practice, he'd told me years ago. And researchers need practical applications for their theories. The sweet spot is where thinking and doing intersect. I'd found that sweet spot without looking for it, backed into a career that combined everything I valued. Marine biology systems thinking, architecture's practical problem solving, teaching's intellectual exploration. Dad had known, somehow, that I'd end up here eventually. The inheritance wasn't forcing me into his profession. It was clearing the path to discover my own version of it. The library design phase concluded in autumn, community input integrated into every decision. The building would be modern but warm, efficient but welcoming, technologically current but not intimidating. Most importantly, it would serve multiple functions: library and community center and job resource hub and quiet refuge. Uncle David approved the final designs with obvious satisfaction. Richard's influence is all over this, but it's also distinctly yours. The environmental systems integration, the way you've thought about the building as part of the larger urban ecosystem, that's your expertise shaping his approach. This is what succession should look like. Not copying, but evolving. The Richard Chen Community Center's first year proved Dad's design wisdom. The building was constantly occupied, programs running daily, the commercial kitchen hosting cooking classes and catering businesses, the meeting rooms booked months in advance. The rooftop garden produced food that supplied the kitchen and taught urban agriculture. Most significantly, the building had become the neighborhood's anchor, the place people gathered during crises and celebrations. When a winter storm knocked out power, the community center's backup systems and geothermal heating provided refuge. When the neighborhood organized against a predatory lending operation targeting elderly residents, they met in the center's rooms. When families needed space for quinceañeras or memorials or celebrations, the center adapted to their needs. This was architecture succeeding at its highest purpose, not just providing shelter but enabling community. Patricia's second parole hearing came and went with the same result. Denied. Her attorney stopped filing appeals, recognizing the pattern evidence made early release impossible. She'd served most of her sentence, emerging in her mid-50s with a felony record and massive restitution debt. Sophie had stopped visiting her mother entirely, a difficult but necessary boundary. "I hope she uses this time to actually change," Sophie said. "To understand what she did and why it was wrong. But whether she does or not, I'm moving forward. I can't let her choices define my life." The firm won 2 more significant contracts that year, a mixed-use development emphasizing sustainable systems and a renovation of historic buildings for affordable housing. Chen and Associates was becoming known for environmentally conscious design that served communities rather than displacing them. My research on built environments and ecosystem health was published in an environmental design journal, connecting marine biology principles with urban planning. The paper attracted attention from planners struggling to address climate change and urban density simultaneously. I started receiving speaking invitations, requests to consult on projects, inquiries about collaborative research. Dad's legacy was expanding beyond what he'd built directly, influencing how other architects and planners approached their work. That was immortality, ideas spreading and evolving, continuing to shape the world long after their originator was gone. Uncle David announced his retirement at the firm's annual meeting, 35 years after he and Dad had founded Chen and Associates. "I'm tired," he said simply. "Ready to travel, to paint, to do all the things I postponed while building this firm. But I'm leaving it in capable hands. Maya has brought fresh thinking while honoring Richard's principles. The firm's future is secure." Becoming sole principal of Chen and Associates was terrifying and exhilarating simultaneously. I'd been preparing for 3 years, learning the business while developing my own approach. But stepping fully into leadership meant accepting ultimate responsibility for decisions that affected 15 employees and countless clients. Sarah Kim became my unofficial partner, senior designer with decades of experience balancing my theoretical knowledge. Together we shaped the firm's direction, selective about projects, insistent on sustainable practices, committed to community-focused design. The house on Laurelhurst Drive was finally complete, every room restored to Dad's vision or thoughtfully updated where his design could be improved. Sophie and I hosted a gathering, inviting everyone who'd helped with the renovation, the legal battles, the firm transition. Uncle David and James Morrison, Dr. Wang and Lynn the pawn specialist, neighbors who'd supported us, Dad's former colleagues and students. We stood in the living room, Dad's built-in bookshelves perfectly recreated, his architectural volumes returned to their proper places. Someone proposed a toast to Richard Chen, architect and father, who'd built more than buildings. To Dad, I said, raising my glass. Who taught me to see structure in systems, beauty in function, and legacy in choices that outlive us. This house, the firm, the community center, they're not monuments. They're starting points for work that continues. That's the inheritance he really left, not assets but approaches, not buildings but beliefs. The gathering lasted into the evening, stories shared and memories honored. This was what Dad had wanted, not grief-stricken preservation of the past, but joyful continuation of his work. The house was alive again, filled with people and purpose and possibility. I found myself in Dad's workshop later, after guests had departed. His tools hung on the pegboard, recovered from pawn shops and estate sales, returned to their proper places. The drafting table held current projects, my work now rather than his, but still guided by principles he'd taught. The Purple Heart medal sat in a shadow box on the wall, finally home, properly honored. Beside it, a photo of Dad in his prime, hard hat and work boots, standing beside a building he'd designed. Not his most famous project, but one he'd loved particularly, affordable housing that had transformed a struggling neighborhood. That was the goal now, continuing that work, using architecture to improve lives rather than simply fill space. Dad had shown the way. My job was walking the path, adapting his approach to new challenges, teaching the next generation to think about buildings as systems that interact with communities and environments. The second envelope had contained more than a revised will. It had contained possibility, the tools and resources to continue meaningful work. Dad's final gift wasn't wealth or property. It was the opportunity to build something that mattered, to contribute to a legacy larger than any single person. Patricia had tried to steal that opportunity, to liquidate everything Dad built and scatter it to the winds. She'd failed because Dad had prepared, documented, protected what mattered. The building still stood. The firm continued. The work persisted. That was victory, not perfect or complete, but real. Justice served, legacy preserved, future secured. Everything else was details. The library project broke ground on a cold March morning. Elected officials and community members gathered despite the drizzle that characterized Portland Springs. I'd learned to give speeches without notes, trusting the preparation work to carry me through public moments that still felt unnatural. The construction crew was led by Maria Santos, a woman who'd worked her way up from laborer to general contractor over 25 years. She'd built 3 of Dad's later projects and understood his obsession with quality craftsmanship. Your father once made us tear out an entire wall because the framing was 2 inches off specification, Maria told me during our first site meeting. We thought he was being ridiculous. Then he showed us how that 2 inches would have created stress points that would fail in 20 years. He wasn't a perfectionist for ego. He was thinking about the people who'd use these buildings decades from now. That perspective shaped every decision we made on the library. Material selected for durability and sustainability rather than lowest bid. Systems designed for long-term efficiency rather than short-term savings. Details that might seem excessive but would matter when the building aged. The Portland State students in my environmental design course used the library as their semester project, analyzing our decisions and proposing alternatives. Some suggestions were impractical, others brilliant. We incorporated the best ideas, turning the building into a teaching tool before construction was even complete. One student, Marcus Thompson, had a background in social work before returning to school for architecture. His thesis examined how building design could reduce barriers for people experiencing homelessness, creating spaces that were welcoming rather than hostile. Public buildings usually try to prevent certain populations from using them, Marcus argued during a critique session. Armrests on benches to prevent sleeping, limited bathroom access, security that profiles based on appearance. What if we designed spaces that acknowledged people's actual needs rather than trying to engineer them away? The question sparked heated discussion. Some students argued that libraries needed boundaries, that allowing unrestricted access created safety issues. Others pointed out that hostile architecture simply moved problems elsewhere rather than solving them. Your father addressed this in the community center design, I told Marcus. Look at how he handled the public restrooms. Individual stalls with floor-to-ceiling doors for privacy and dignity. Washing stations accessible without entering the main facilities. Water fountains positioned where people could refill bottles. He wasn't naive about potential issues, but he designed for human dignity first. Marcus incorporated those principles into his thesis, proposing a shelter facility that functioned as both emergency housing and community resource center. The design was sophisticated, carefully balancing openness with security, dignity with practical needs. Sarah Kim was so impressed she offered Marcus an internship at the firm for the summer. The house required constant maintenance, not because of problems but because I'd committed to preserving Dad's work properly. The koi pond needed regular attention, water chemistry monitored, filters cleaned, fish health checked. The garden required seasonal planting, Sophie developing expertise in the native species Dad had favored. The workshop tools needed care, sharpening and oiling and proper storage. These tasks became meditation, physical work that balanced the mental demands of running an architecture firm and teaching. I understood why Dad had spent evenings in the workshop or by the pond. Creating with your hands after spending days with abstractions that grounded you in material reality. James Morrison stopped by one evening while I was working in the garden, pulling early spring weeds and preparing beds for summer vegetables. He'd aged noticeably since Dad's death, the stress of the legal battles taking their toll despite our victories. I'm retiring next month, he announced, settling onto the garden bench Dad had built. 42 years of practice is enough. Time to travel, spend time with grandchildren, read books that aren't legal briefs. You've earned it, I said, sitting beside him with dirt-stained hands. Dad's estate alone was a full-time job. Satisfying work though, seeing justice done. Not every case ends with the right outcome. He paused, choosing words carefully. I wanted you to know that your father's video testimony has been used in 2 other elder abuse cases. Attorneys saw the news coverage and reached out. Richard's documentation became a template for how to protect yourself and build an evidentiary case. Dad's influence spreading again, helping people he'd never meet, solving problems that extended beyond his immediate situation. That was the definition of meaningful work, impact that rippled outward indefinitely. Patricia's due for another parole hearing in 4 months, James continued. Third one. The pattern suggests she'll be denied again, but you should be prepared to submit opposition if needed. Has she shown any genuine remorse? Any understanding of what she did? James shook his head slowly. Her letters to the parole board focus on how prison is unfair, how she was targeted, how the system failed to consider her perspective. Classic narcissist pattern, viewing herself as the victim regardless of objective reality. Some people never changed, never developed the self-awareness necessary for genuine growth. Patricia would likely leave prison eventually, still believing she'd been wronged, still dangerous to any vulnerable person who crossed her path. The restraining order is permanent, James assured me. And she's flagged in databases that financial institutions and care facilities check. She'll find it difficult to repeat her pattern even after release. The firm hired 2 additional architects that summer, expanding to handle the increasing project load. Our reputation for sustainable community-focused design was attracting clients who might have previously gone to larger firms. The work was demanding but meaningful, exactly what Dad had spent 4 decades building toward. One project particularly captured my attention, a proposal to redesign a failing shopping center into mixed-use affordable housing and commercial space. The developer was committed to keeping rents accessible while creating economically viable businesses. It was complex, balancing competing needs and limited budgets, but exactly the kind of challenge that made architecture matter. Sarah and I led the design team, working closely with community organizations to understand needs. We held workshops in the existing shopping center, inviting residents to share their experiences and hopes. An elderly woman talked about needing medical services within walking distance. A single mother described the challenge of finding childcare near work. A teenager mentioned the absence of safe gathering spaces for young people. Each conversation refined our understanding, shaping decisions about space allocation, service integration, accessibility features. The building that emerged from this process wasn't what we'd have designed in isolation. It was better, informed by actual lived experience rather than assumptions about what communities needed. Uncle David visited the site during early construction, hard hat and work boots, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. Retirement suited him. He'd been painting prolifically, watercolors of buildings he and Dad had designed, capturing them in different lights and seasons. "You found your voice," he said, studying the construction progress. "This doesn't look like Richard's work exactly, but it's clearly influenced by his philosophy. You've integrated your environmental systems thinking in ways he never fully explored. Evolution, not imitation. That's proper succession." The teaching continued, providing unexpected rewards. Students would email years after graduation, sharing how the course had changed their approach to design, made them think about buildings differently. One former student was working for a nonprofit developing sustainable housing in rural communities. Another had joined the Peace Corps, bringing architectural expertise to infrastructure projects in developing nations. Education multiplied impact in ways individual practice never could. Every student who absorbed these principles and carried them into their careers extended the influence exponentially. Dad had taught occasionally, guest lectures and studio critiques, but he'd focused primarily on practice. I was discovering that balancing both created synergy, each strengthening the other. Sophie graduated with her bachelor's degree in social work that spring, immediately hired by Adult Protective Services to investigate elder abuse cases. Her first-hand experience with Patricia's manipulation made her particularly effective at recognizing patterns others might miss. "I met with an 82-year-old man today," she told me over dinner one evening. His new wife was isolating him from family, controlling his finances, making him sign documents he didn't understand. Classic Patricia playbook. But because I recognized the signs early, we intervened before significant damage occurred. They're divorcing now, and he's reconnecting with his kids. That was redemption, transforming personal trauma into professional skill that protected others. Sophie had every reason to be bitter about her mother's crimes. Instead, she'd channeled that experience into preventing similar situations. Not everyone managed that kind of psychological alchemy. Patricia's third parole hearing happened in July, conducted via video conference due to prison capacity issues. Her attorney made the same arguments: model prisoner, remorse, low risk of reoffending. The prosecutor countered with the pattern evidence, the multiple victims, the sophisticated nature of her schemes. Parole denied, the board announced after 15 minutes of deliberation. Petitioner shows insufficient insight into the harmful nature of her actions. Next review in 24 months. Patricia's face on the video screen remained impassive, but I caught a flicker of rage before she controlled her expression. She'd expected release, believed her performance of remorse would be sufficient. The denial meant serving at least 4.5 years total, possibly the full 6 depending on future hearings. The library opened in September, ribbon-cutting ceremony attended by hundreds of residents from surrounding neighborhoods. The building was everything we'd hoped: light-filled and welcoming, efficient and adaptable, serving multiple functions seamlessly. The children's section featured interactive exhibits about environmental systems, teaching basic ecology through play. The adult sections included job resource computers and career counseling spaces. The community rooms hosted everything from ESL classes to startup incubator meetings. The building breathed, adapted, served. Marcus Thompson's thesis design was displayed in the main lobby, his proposal for dignity-centered homeless services attracting interest from city planners and nonprofit organizations. Several groups approached him about turning the concept into reality, potentially creating Portland's first architecture-led approach to housing insecurity. That was education working perfectly, preparing students not just to practice their profession but to use it for solving pressing social problems. Marcus had found his calling, and the library project had helped shape his understanding of what architecture could accomplish beyond aesthetic achievement. The firm celebrated its 41st anniversary that fall, longer than most architecture practices survived. We'd not only endured Dad's death and Patricia's attempted destruction, we'd grown stronger, more focused, more aligned with values that gave work meaning beyond profit. Sarah Kim proposed a partnership structure, distributing ownership among senior staff rather than maintaining single principal control. The model would provide stability if something happened to me while ensuring the firm's philosophy persisted regardless of individual leadership. Richard built this firm on principles, not personality, Sarah argued during our strategic planning session. Making it dependent on one person, even you, contradicts that foundation. Distributed ownership means the approach survives any individual's departure. She was right. Dad's greatest achievement wasn't any specific building, it was creating a culture and methodology that could persist independently. Converting the firm to partnership model honored that achievement while protecting against future vulnerability. The house had become a gathering place again, dinner parties and firm meetings and student sessions around the dining table Dad had built. Sophie hosted her social work colleagues for case consultations, the living room becoming an informal think tank for addressing elder abuse patterns. I met with thesis students in Dad's study, surrounded by his books and tools, helping them develop research questions. The space was alive, serving its designed purpose, connecting people and facilitating work that mattered. That was what Dad had intended when he built it, not a museum preserving the past but a functional home enabling future activity. Dr. Helen Wang called one October evening with unexpected news. She'd been contacted by medical researchers studying end-of-life decision-making and the impact of isolation on terminal patients. They wanted to interview her about Dad's case, how he'd maintained lucidity and agency despite Patricia's attempts at control. Richard's video testimony is being used in medical ethics courses, Helen explained. Teaching doctors to recognize when family members might be manipulating patients, how to document capacity, how to protect vulnerable people's autonomy. His final months are helping train the next generation of physicians. Dad's influence continued expanding, reaching domains he'd never anticipated. The video he'd recorded to protect me and preserve his architectural legacy was now teaching medical students about patient advocacy and elder abuse recognition. Would you be willing to speak to a medical school class? Helen asked. Share your perspective as the daughter who wasn't allowed access. Explain how the isolation affected family dynamics. The students need to understand the full impact, not just the legal and medical aspects. I agreed, adding medical school lectures to my growing speaking schedule. Each presentation was an opportunity to extend Dad's final lesson, that documentation and preparation could protect vulnerable people even after death. The firm won a prestigious industry award that winter, recognition for the library project's innovative integration of environmental design and community needs. The award ceremony in Seattle attracted architects from across the region, many curious about Chen and Associates' recent evolution. Your father's firm was always respected, one established architect told me at the reception. But you've taken it somewhere new, adding dimensions Richard never fully explored. The environmental systems integration, the community engagement methodology, the teaching component. It's architecture as social practice, not just spatial design. That captured what I'd been trying to articulate, the difference between Dad's approach and my evolution of it. He believed buildings should serve communities. I believed buildings were communities, complex ecosystems where environmental, social, and economic factors interacted constantly. Marcus Thompson joined the firm full-time after graduation, bringing his social services background into our design process. His first project was developing a network of micro-housing units for people transitioning out of homelessness, small structures that provided dignity and security while connecting residents to supportive services. The design challenged conventional approaches, rejecting the institutional feel of most transitional housing in favor of individual autonomy and privacy. Each unit had its own entrance, bathroom, kitchenette, and lockable door. The site included shared community spaces and service coordination, but residents controlled their own environments. People experiencing homelessness lose agency over almost every aspect of their lives, Marcus explained during the design presentation. This housing model returns that agency while providing structure and support. Architecture becomes a tool for rebuilding independence rather than enforcing dependence. The city approved the pilot project, funding for 50 units to be built in phases. If successful, the model could expand citywide, Portland's architectural community leading the way on housing-first approaches that respected human dignity. That was architecture fulfilling its highest purpose, not just creating shelter but enabling human flourishing. Dad would have loved this project, would have mentored Marcus personally, would have pushed the design to be even more ambitious. I felt his presence constantly, not as ghost or memory, but as internalized voice offering guidance and challenge. What would Dad do? How would he approach this problem? What details matter most? The questions shaped decisions, kept me connected to principles that transcended individual projects. Sophie moved into her own apartment that winter, ready for full independence after 3 years in the house. We'd restored our sibling relationship despite the circumstances of its creation, building something genuine from Patricia's manipulation. "Thank you for not giving up on me," she said while packing her belongings. "After everything Mom did, you could have written me off as part of her damage. Instead, you gave me space to become my own person." "You did that yourself," I said honestly. "I just provided a safe place while you figured it out." She hugged me, fierce and grateful. "Richard would be proud of you. Not just the architecture stuff, though that's impressive. Proud of how you've handled all of this, the legal battles and the firm and helping me. You turned Patricia's attempt to destroy everything into something constructive." After Sophie left, the house felt genuinely empty for the first time since I'd moved back. But it was a comfortable emptiness, the natural quiet of a space between activities rather than abandonment's hollow silence. I spent that evening in the workshop, using Dad's tools to build a bookshelf for my office at Portland State. The wood was reclaimed Douglas fir from a deconstructed warehouse, the same material Dad had favored for its character and history. Working with hand tools, measuring precisely, cutting carefully, the process was meditation and connection simultaneously. The bookshelf wasn't architecturally significant, wouldn't win awards or change anyone's life. But it was made with skill and attention, built to last, functional and beautiful in equal measure. That was Dad's philosophy distilled: do good work regardless of scale, care about craft regardless of audience, build things that honor both material and purpose. The firm's partnership restructuring finalized in December, ownership distributed among 5 senior architects including myself. Each partner brought distinct expertise, together creating organizational resilience that no individual could provide. Chen and Associates would survive our individual departures, the principles and approach persisting across generations. Patricia had tried to liquidate the firm, treating it as asset to be sold at maximum profit. She'd failed to understand that the real value wasn't in accounts receivable or project portfolio, it was in methodology and culture, in the approach to design that made Chen and Associates distinct. You couldn't liquidate an approach. You couldn't sell a philosophy. The firm's actual worth was in the minds and practices of the people who worked there, the accumulated wisdom of 40 years of thoughtful practice. The year ended with the community center's first anniversary celebration, neighborhood residents gathering to mark 12 months of successful operation. The building had exceeded every metric: utilization rates, community satisfaction, economic impact, environmental performance. More importantly, it had become genuinely beloved, the kind of space people fought to protect rather than merely tolerated. Mr. Washington, the elderly man who'd painted the historical mural, stood at the podium sharing stories of the center's impact. His grandson had gotten his first job working in the commercial kitchen. His neighbor had found housing assistance through programs hosted in the meeting rooms. His church held services in the flexible gathering space when their building flooded. Richard Chen designed a building that catches us when we fall and lifts us when we rise, Mr. Washington said, voice carrying across the packed main hall. That's more than architecture. That's love made concrete and steel. The applause was thunderous, residents standing and cheering. Dad would have been uncomfortable with the praise, would have deflected credit to the community and the construction team. But he would have been satisfied seeing his final project succeed so completely. I stood in the back of the hall watching the celebration, feeling the weight of responsibility and the lightness of purpose simultaneously. This was the inheritance Dad had really left, not buildings or businesses but the obligation and opportunity to continue meaningful work. Patricia had tried to steal that inheritance, to reduce it to cash value and scatter it to the winds. She'd failed because she'd never understood what she was actually trying to take. The inheritance wasn't material, it was conceptual, the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent building things that mattered. That couldn't be forged, couldn't be stolen, couldn't be liquidated. It could only be honored by continuing the work, evolving the approach, passing the lessons to the next generation. Dad's video testimony had ended with instructions to build something beautiful with what he was leaving me. I'd interpreted that literally at first, finishing the community center, designing the library, managing the firm. But the real instruction was broader: build a beautiful life, a practice aligned with values, work that contributed something meaningful to the world. Architecture was just the medium, the beautiful part was the purpose behind it. Standing in the community center watching residents celebrate their space, I understood what Dad had really given me. Not buildings or bank accounts, not even the firm or the house. He'd given me the example of a life well lived, work that mattered, choices that aligned with principles. The second envelope had contained more than legal documents. It had contained permission to build my own version of the life Dad modeled, to take his lessons and create something distinctly mine while honoring the source. That was inheritance at its best, not preservation but evolution, not imitation but inspiration. Dad's work continued not because I copied him, but because I understood what he was really teaching. Build things that matter. Serve communities authentically. Think long-term. Maintain integrity. Keep learning. Stay humble. Those weren't architectural principles, they were life principles that happened to apply to architecture. Patricia had seen only the material inheritance, the assets she could liquidate and consume. She'd missed the actual legacy, the philosophical inheritance that couldn't be stolen because it lived in how people thought and acted and built. The celebration continued around me, music and food and joy in a space designed to enable exactly this kind of gathering. Dad's presence was palpable, not as ghost or memory, but as living influence in every detail and decision. The second envelope had changed everything, but not in the way Patricia feared. It hadn't just redistributed assets. It had revealed truths, provided tools, protected possibilities. Most importantly, it had given me the framework to build something beautiful from the wreckage of loss and betrayal. That was Dad's final gift, not inheritance as preservation of the past, but inheritance as foundation for the future. Everything else was just paperwork. 5 years passed like water through fingers, each season bringing new projects and challenges. The firm had grown to 23 employees, our portfolio filled with buildings that prioritized community impact over architectural vanity. Portland State promoted me to associate professor with tenure, my research on ecological urbanism cited in planning journals and environmental policy papers. The house on Laurelhurst Drive had matured into its best self, gardens flourishing under careful tending, the koi pond supporting 3 generations of fish now, Dad's workshop producing furniture for friends and family. I'd built a life there that honored his memory without being trapped by it, each room serving present needs while acknowledging past significance. Patricia was released on her 4th parole hearing, having served 5 years of her 6-year sentence. The restraining order remained in effect, prohibiting contact with Sophie or me, restricting her from employment in elder care or financial services. She'd left Oregon immediately, her attorney informing James she was relocating to Arizona where nobody knew her history. Sophie had married another social worker, bought a small house near the community center, and was expecting her first child. She'd invited me to be godmother, the honorary aunt who'd provided refuge when she needed it most. We had dinner monthly, our relationship no longer defined by Patricia's crimes but by genuine affection and shared values. Uncle David had passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years after retirement, his memorial held at the community center with hundreds of former colleagues and clients sharing stories. He'd left his share of the architectural archives to Portland State, establishing an endowment for students pursuing socially conscious design. His paintings of Dad's buildings hung in the firm's conference room, watercolor ghosts of structures that continued serving their communities. The microhousing project Marcus had designed became Portland's model for addressing housing insecurity, 50 units expanding to 200 across 5 sites. National architecture publications featured the work, other cities reaching out to learn the methodology. Marcus had become a partner in the firm, his expertise in human-centered design for vulnerable populations making us leaders in an emerging specialty. The library we'd built had won multiple awards, not for aesthetic innovation but for functional success. Circulation numbers exceeded projections by 40%. Community program attendance was triple the city average. Most tellingly, people called it our library with possessive pride, treating the building as collectively owned rather than municipally imposed. I stood at the community center on a bright April morning, preparing for the groundbreaking of an expansion Dad's original design had always anticipated. The neighborhood had grown, demand for services exceeding capacity. We were adding a medical clinic wing, partnering with a community health organization to provide primary care in the same building as the social services. The design integrated everything I'd learned over 5 years of practice and teaching: environmental systems thinking, community engagement methodology, sustainable materials, flexible spaces. But it was also clearly influenced by Dad's original vision, the bones of his approach supporting my elaboration. Sarah Kim stood beside me reviewing the final construction documents, her reading glasses sliding down her nose as they always did when she concentrated. She'd become more than a colleague, more than a mentor, the closest thing to family beyond Sophie and the memory of parents and uncle. Richard would love this addition, she said, tracing the connection between old building and new wing. You've honored his design while extending it in ways he never imagined. That's what legacy should look like. The construction crew arrived, Maria Santos still leading despite approaching 70. She'd sworn the community center would be her final project before retiring. Then we'd proposed the expansion and she'd committed to one more, unwilling to trust Dad's building to anyone else. The ceremony was simple. Neighborhood residents and city officials gathered to mark the beginning. I gave brief remarks about Dad's vision, the community's embrace of it, and the continuing need for spaces that served rather than imposed. Then we broke ground together, multiple shovels turning earth simultaneously, collective action beginning collective benefit. My phone buzzed during the reception afterward. A message from an unknown number with an Arizona area code. Against my better judgment, I opened it. I know I'm not supposed to contact you. But I wanted you to know I understand now what I did to your father, to you, to Sophie. Prison gave me time to actually think rather than scheme. I'm not asking forgiveness or trying to reconnect. Just acknowledging that you were right and I was wrong. Richard deserved better. So did you. I'm sorry. Patricia. 5 years later, finally claiming to understand. I stared at the message, trying to determine if it was genuine remorse or another manipulation. With Patricia, sincerity and performance were indistinguishable, perhaps even to herself. I didn't respond. Didn't block the number either. Just let the message exist, acknowledged but not engaged. Maybe she had changed. Maybe prison had cracked the narcissistic shell enough for actual self-awareness. Or maybe this was another play, testing whether I'd respond, looking for an opening. Either way, it didn't matter. My life wasn't defined by Patricia's crimes anymore, wasn't oriented around her destruction or recovery. She was simply someone who tried to steal something valuable and failed, significant in the past but irrelevant to the present. Sophie called that evening, breathless with excitement. The baby kicked. Like, really kicked, not just flutters. I think she's going to be a soccer player. We talked for an hour about nursery colors and name options and the terrifying joy of impending parenthood. Sophie had built a beautiful life from the wreckage of her mother's choices, found love and purpose and meaning despite being raised by someone incapable of modeling those qualities. Have you thought about what happens to the house eventually? Sophie asked. I mean, you're only 36, you've got decades ahead. But do you imagine passing it to someone, keeping it in the family, turning it into something else? I looked around Dad's study, at the seahorse tank bubbling quietly, at the bookshelves holding both his architectural volumes and my marine biology texts, at the drafting table where current projects sat beside his unfinished sketches. I think it should become what it needs to become, I said. Maybe one of your kids will want it someday. Maybe it becomes office space for the firm. Maybe it gets sold to a young family who'll raise their own children here. The building doesn't care about sentiment. It cares about being used well, maintained properly, allowed to serve its purpose. That was the lesson Dad had actually taught, not that buildings were sacred monuments, but that they were tools for living well. The house's value wasn't in preserving it exactly as he'd left it, but in allowing it to continue serving whoever needed it next. The partnership meeting the following week focused on strategic planning, deciding which opportunities aligned with our values and which would dilute our focus. We'd received proposals for 3 major projects: a corporate campus, a luxury mixed-use development, and a community college renovation. The corporate campus offered the highest fees and prestige. The luxury development had the most creative freedom. The community college aligned with our mission but paid modestly and would stretch our capacity. Richard would have taken the community college, one partner said, stating what everyone knew. Richard also nearly bankrupted the firm twice following his principles over profit, another countered. We can't sustain operations on idealism alone. The debate lasted 2 hours, examining finances and capacity and values. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice cutting through the circular arguments. We take the community college and find a way to make the numbers work. That's who we are. If we start choosing projects solely for profit, we become just another architecture firm. Our distinction is in maintaining principles even when it's financially uncomfortable. That's Chen and Associates' actual brand value. We voted unanimously for the community college. Then spent another hour figuring out how to structure the project to be economically sustainable while delivering the quality they deserved. That was the real inheritance, not specific buildings or business assets, but the commitment to choose principles over convenience, to maintain values even under pressure, to build things that mattered regardless of profit margins. Dad had modeled that approach for 40 years. The firm embodied it. My job was continuing that tradition while adapting to changing contexts, holding the core steady while the surface evolved. The teaching remained deeply rewarding, watching students discover that architecture could be about more than aesthetic innovation or technical prowess. That buildings could heal communities, restore ecosystems, address social inequities, provide dignity to marginalized populations. Marcus Guest lectured in my course, sharing the microhousing project and explaining how design choices either reinforced or challenged societal assumptions about homelessness. Students asked sophisticated questions, pushed back on assumptions, proposed alternatives. This was education working perfectly, preparing minds to think critically about built environments and their social impacts. The second envelope had started this journey, Dad's careful planning creating opportunities I'd never anticipated. But 5 years later, the momentum was self-sustaining, no longer dependent on inheritance or obligation, but driven by genuine belief in the work's value. I'd built something beautiful with what Dad left me, not because he required it, but because I discovered it was what I actually wanted to build. The architecture, the teaching, the community engagement, they weren't duties imposed by inheritance. They were calling discovered through the process of honoring someone else's legacy. That was the gift hidden in the second envelope, not specific assets or legal protections, but the framework for discovering purpose, for finding work that aligned values and skills, for building a life of meaning rather than mere accomplishment. Patricia had tried to steal money and property. She'd missed the actual treasure, the philosophical inheritance that shaped how I understood work and worth, success and significance. The community center expansion opened 18 months later, medical clinic operating alongside the social services and community programs Dad had envisioned. Neighborhood health outcomes improved measurably within the first year, the building proving that architecture could deliver quantifiable social benefits when designed with genuine community needs in mind. Standing at the dedication ceremony, watching children play in the expanded courtyard while their parents accessed healthcare and job training, I felt Dad's presence not as memory but as living influence in every detail. The second envelope hadn't just protected his assets. It had transmitted his values, provided tools for their application, ensured their continuation beyond his lifetime. That was legacy at its finest, not preservation but propagation, not monument but movement. Sophie's daughter was born that summer, a healthy girl named Helen after Dr. Wang. I held my goddaughter hours after her birth, this tiny person who'd never know Richard Chen but would grow up in a world slightly better because he'd lived in it. That was how influence worked, rippling outward through time and relationships, shaping futures the original actor would never witness. Dad's buildings would serve communities for decades. His firm would continue designing meaningful projects. His approach would influence students and colleagues who'd carry those lessons into their own work. And somewhere, distant and irrelevant, Patricia was living whatever life she'd built after prison, her attempt to erase all this having failed completely. The inheritance continued, not as burden but as blessing, not as obligation but as opportunity. The second envelope had ensured I could choose this path rather than having it chosen for me. That was the real gift, the freedom to discover meaning rather than having it imposed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.